It was raining like a bucket, and darkness enveloped the city. A few friends, Max, Alex, Maggie and Layla, we decided to visit an abandoned studio, which has long been the subject of strange rumors. They came. The studio looked like a giant abandoned box with peeling lamps hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room, among the old boxes and broken chairs, there was a control panel with a screen resembling an old computer screen. Max, who has always been passionate about technology, approached him and saw that familiar names were flashing on the screen. They knew these names. These characters were part of the musical game Incredibox, which was popular among young people. "What is this doing here?" Max said in surprise, coming closer. He couldn't believe that these names, as if they had come to life, appeared in this abandoned studio. Deciding that it was just some kind of strange artifact, he pressed the remote control button. As soon as the screen came to life, the room was filled with soft light, and spunky figures began to appear. Clark was the first, tall, with dark eyes. His face was frighteningly lifeless, and his movements were mechanical, like a puppet. Immediately after him, Wenda appeared on the screen, a girl with a cold look that was so empty that it seemed she had long since lost her soul. Kenny was the third. His bright eyes and strange smile left no sense of peace, and his figure moved across the screen as if it had no boundaries. Then Zeke and Jevon appeared on the screen. Zeke was a dark figure. His body was surrounded by clouds of mist, and his eyes shone like coals. Kevin was a mysterious figure, his face hidden under a hood, and his gaze was so penetrating that even in his silence, there was a sense of menace. At first, the music was familiar to the game. The rhythm was smooth and calm, but soon something changed. The beats became heavier, darker, and each chord seemed to strike into the very depths of consciousness. The music became ominous. It was as if she began to take over the space around her, like invisible chains tightening around her body. Suddenly, the walls of the studio began to bend, and dark shadows crept across the room. The shadows, which at first seemed like ordinary spots on the walls, began to move. Not only did they move, but they seemed to come to life, taking on the images of these very figures. Clark, Wenda, Kenny, Zeke and Jevon began to move in reality, as if they had stepped out of the screen. Max was the first to notice this. He turned around abruptly and saw how Clark approached him, his eyes empty and cold. Fear stirred inside Max. He wanted to move, but his body felt too heavy, and his feet seemed rooted to the floor. His hand reached for his phone, but the screen dimmed, and some strange, distorted faces flashed in his eyes. Clark was standing right in front of him, and his voice was like an icy whisper. "You can't get out of here," he said, and his words echoed in Max's head. "You're a part of us. You're part of the music." Max shouted, trying to push off, but the shadows moving across the room began to bind him, preventing him from getting up. Maggie watched in horror as Wenda approached her. She moved smoothly like a ghost. Her eyes seemed infinitely black, and her footsteps made a strange, menacing sound. "Did you think it was just a game, that you can be an observer?" Wenda whispered. "You're with us. You've always been with us." Maggie tried to step back, but the walls were shrinking and the air was getting viscous, as if every air molecule was filling her lungs with something heavy and dark. She couldn't breathe. Meanwhile, Kenny was already standing next to Layla. His smile was strange, and his eyes sparkled like two sharp knives that were stabbing into the heart. He didn't say a word, but his look spoke for itself. He wanted to take them away. He was a part of this music, and they had to become a part of it too. "You can't leave anymore," Zeke said, his voice echoing, as if he were not one being, but a multitude of voices bouncing off the walls. "We are music. We are not just characters. We are your nightmares. We've always been there for each other." Jevon stood in the shadows, watching his friends immerse themselves in the endless dark music. Suddenly, he held out his arms to Alex. "You're here forever now. You're not leaving." The room was filled with the monstrous rhythm of music. Everything was spinning. The faces of the friends began to blur. Their bodies became transparent, as if they were dissolving into dark, cursed music. Their screams mixed with the beats, and their images disappeared, disappearing into the void. And when the music stopped, the studio was silent again. But if you listen closely, you could hear faint sounds, barely discernible against the background of silence. It was a glimmer of music, never stopping, always sounding somewhere in the distance. And at night, if anyone dares to approach the studio, they can see the figures of Clark, Wenda, Kenny, Zeke and Jevon, creating their endless melodies over and over again, eagerly awaiting those who decide to become part of their eternal, cursed music.